At 5:17 a.m. on September 23, 1942, senior technician Viktor Petrov crawled under the left wing of an Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik at Stalingrad's Gumrak airfield, staring at a propeller blade that should have grounded this aircraft for weeks. The pilot, Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, 24 years old, mechanic's son from Tula, sat in the cockpit preparing for a mission against 40 German panzer tanks advancing on the tractor factory district. Volkov had been flying combat missions over Stalingrad for 6 weeks. 11 missions, 4 confirmed tank kills, 0 aircraft losses. Not because he was lucky, because he was careful. Those tanks would reach Soviet defensive positions in 3 hours. Volkov's IL-2 was the only ground attack aircraft operational that morning. Every other Sturmovik in the squadron had been destroyed, damaged, or was waiting for parts that wouldn't arrive for days. The propeller problem was simple but catastrophic. During yesterday's sortie, Volkov had flown through debris from a destroyed German supply truck. A piece of metal, probably part of a fuel can, had struck the propeller at 280 miles per hour. The impact had gouged a chunk out of blade number 2, creating an imbalance that made the engine vibrate violently at full power. Soviet maintenance regulations were clear. Propeller damage exceeding 15mm depth required complete replacement. This gouge measured 23mm. The aircraft was officially unflyable. Petrov had been maintaining IL-2s since June 1941, 15 months of non-stop combat operations. He knew the Sturmovik inside and out. Twin-seat ground attack aircraft, heavily armoured cockpit, designed to absorb punishment and keep flying. The Germans called it Zement bomber, the concrete bomber, because their machine guns couldn't penetrate its armour. Soviet pilots called it the flying tank, but right now this flying tank couldn't fly. Not officially. The problem wasn't just one aircraft. Stalingrad was burning. German forces had pushed to within 2 kilometres of the Volga River. The city was being strangled. Without air support, the tank columns would break through Soviet lines, cut off the defenders, end the battle. Petrov had watched the city die piece by piece for 3 weeks. Every day fewer aircraft took off. Every day more German tanks rolled closer. What happened in the next 14 minutes would change how every damaged IL-2 in the Soviet Air Force returned to combat. Petrov stood up, wiped the grease from his hands on his already filthy coveralls, walked to the maintenance shed. It was barely dawn. The September air was cold. He could see his breath. In the distance, artillery fire rumbled constantly, the background noise of Stalingrad that never stopped, day or night. The sound had become so normal that Petrov barely noticed it anymore unless it got suddenly louder, which meant the fighting was getting closer. Inside the shed, he found what he was looking for: a metal file. Not just any file, a precision bastard file used for shaping aluminum parts. He grabbed it, felt its weight, tested its edge against his thumb. Sharp enough. He walked back to the aircraft, climbed onto the wing, reached up to the propeller. The standard solution to propeller damage was replacement. But there were no replacement propellers at Gumrak. The nearest depot was 400 kilometers away in Saratov. Even if they radioed for one immediately, it wouldn't arrive for 5 days. The tanks would be in the city by then. Volkov had suggested flying anyway. Accept the vibration, keep the engine below maximum power, make the attack work with reduced performance. Petrov had told him that would get him killed. The vibration would shake the engine mounts loose within 20 minutes of flight time. The engine would literally tear itself off the aircraft. Volkov would crash before he even reached the target area. But Petrov had an idea that violated every engineering principle in the Soviet Air Force technical manual. The IL-2's propeller was a 3-blade constant-speed design manufactured at factory number 23 in Moscow. The blades were individually mounted and could be adjusted for pitch. Each blade was precisely balanced at the factory to tolerances of less than 1 gram. That balance was critical. At full power, the propeller spun at 2,050 RPM. Any imbalance created vibration. Significant imbalance created catastrophic vibration. What if, instead of replacing the damaged blade, Petrov damaged the other 2 blades in exactly the same way? Create 3 identical gouges. The propeller would still be damaged, but it would be balanced. The vibration would disappear. Theoretically, it was insane. Deliberately damaging an already compromised propeller. taking an aircraft that had one broken blade and giving it 3 broken blades. But the mathematics made sense. Vibration came from imbalance. If all 3 blades had identical damage, the imbalance would cancel out. The propeller would be weaker, sure. It might not handle maximum continuous power for extended periods. But for one mission? Maybe. Possibly. Petrov measured the damage on blade 2 with calipers. 23mm deep, 45mm wide, positioned 680mm from the hub. He took the file, positioned it against blade 1 at exactly the same spot, started filing. The work required precision. Too shallow, and the balance wouldn't work. Too deep, and he'd weaken the blade structure to the point of failure. He filed slowly, carefully, checking his measurements every few strokes. The first gouge took 6 minutes. He moved to blade 3, repeated the process. Another 5 minutes. When he finished, all 3 blades looked identical, symmetrically damaged. He stepped back, looked at what he'd done. Either this was brilliant, or he just sabotaged the aircraft and condemned Volkov to death. This wasn't the first time Petrov had bent the rules to keep aircraft flying. 3 weeks earlier, on September 2nd, Petrov had field-repaired a damaged oil cooler on Lieutenant Karpov's IL-2 using parts from a wrecked truck radiator. The regulations said oil coolers required factory replacement. Petrov brazed a patch over the bullet holes, tested it, declared it serviceable. Karpov flew that aircraft for 8 more missions before being shot down over the Barricadi factory. Karpov survived. The oil cooler held. Before that, in August, Petrov had rewired an electrical system using copper wire salvaged from a destroyed building in the city. The proper aviation-grade wire was out of stock. The copper wire worked. The aircraft flew. The Soviet Air Force at Stalingrad was held together with improvisation, desperation, and mechanics like Petrov, who knew the difference between regulations and reality. The regulations were written by engineers in comfortable offices in Moscow who had never watched a city burn, had never seen German tanks rolling toward their airfield, had never held the hand of a dying pilot who'd crashed because his aircraft couldn't be repaired in time. Petrov had seen all of that. In the past 15 months, he'd lost count of how many pilots he'd worked with who never came back. Good men. Brave men. Kids, mostly. The average age of a Soviet pilot in 1942 was 22 years old. They arrived fresh from training, excited, confident. Most were dead within 2 weeks. Lieutenant Pavel Sokolov had been Petrov's first loss. July 1941. Sokolov was 21, from a collective farm near Kursk. He'd talked constantly about his sister, how she'd promised to write him every week. Sokolov flew 3 missions, then got hit by flak during a low-level attack near Rostov. The IL-2 went down in flames. Sokolov didn't get out. Petrov had maintained that aircraft, had signed off the pre-flight inspection that morning. Everything was perfect. The aircraft was fine. Sokolov died anyway. Captain Mikhail Ivanov lasted longer. 6 weeks, 31 missions. Ivanov was experienced, careful, smart. He knew how to survive. On August 15th, his IL-2 took a direct hit from an 88mm flak gun while attacking German positions near the Red October factory. The shell went through the cockpit. Ivanov died instantly. His aircraft crashed into the Volga River. They never recovered the body. 3 days ago, Senior Sergeant Alexei Kozlov crashed on landing after his hydraulic system failed from battle damage. Petrov had warned him the hydraulics were questionable, suggested aborting the mission. Kozlov insisted on flying, said the infantry needed air support. He made his attack run, shot up a German supply column, started back to base. The hydraulics failed completely 2 kilometers from the airfield. Kozlov tried to land without brakes or flaps. The IL-2 overran the runway, hit a drainage ditch, flipped over. Kozlov broke his neck, died before they could pull him out of the wreckage. Petrov had worked on all their aircraft, had signed all their maintenance logs, had watched them taxi out. Some came back. Most didn't. Volkov had been different, careful, smart. On his first mission, August 11th, he'd attacked a German convoy on the road to Kalash. Made 1 pass, destroyed 2 trucks, climbed out immediately, didn't stick around for a second attack, came back with minimal damage. His second mission, August 13th, Volkov attacked artillery positions near the Mamayev Kurgan, waited for the flak to quiet down, made his run, got out clean. 3 missions, 4 missions, 5. Volkov developed a pattern, never took unnecessary risks, never pushed his luck. Made his attack, achieved his objective, came home. On his 7th mission, September 4th, Volkov's wingman, Lieutenant Grigoriev, got greedy. They'd hit a German tank column. Grigoriev went back for a 3rd pass. Volkov told him to climb out, head home. Grigoriev ignored him, said there were still targets. Grigoriev's IL-2 took a direct 88mm hit on his 4th pass. The aircraft exploded. No parachute. Grigoriev was 23 years old, from Moscow, engaged to be married. His fiancée's name was Anna. She'd sent him a letter just 2 days earlier talking about their wedding plans after the war. Volkov watched it happen. Couldn't do anything. Radio crackled with Grigoriev's final transmission, just static and screaming, then nothing. That night, Volkov told Petrov he'd never make more than 2 passes on a single target. Ever. 2 passes maximum, then climb out. Didn't matter how many tanks were left, didn't matter what the target was, survive to fly tomorrow. Grigoriev's death had taught him that lesson. Petrov respected that. Volkov wasn't trying to be a hero, he was trying to survive. And in Stalingrad, survival was the hardest mission of all. Now he was about to send Volkov out in an aircraft with a deliberately damaged propeller. Volkov knew the risks, understood that the modification was untested, unproven. But he also understood that without air support, German tanks would reach the Volga. The choice was simple: fly or watch the city fall. At 5:43 a.m., Volkov climbed into the cockpit. Petrov stood next to the wing, watching. Other mechanics had gathered. Word had spread about the modification. Some thought Petrov was brilliant. Others thought he was insane. One mechanic, an older man named Yuri, who'd been maintaining aircraft since the Spanish Civil War, shook his head and walked away. Said he didn't want to watch another pilot die. Volkov went through his pre-flight checks, magnetos, fuel selector, trim settings, everything by the book. He looked down at Petrov, gave him a questioning look. Petrov nodded. Volkov hit the starter. The Mikulin AM-38 engine coughed once, twice, caught, roared to life. 12 cylinders, 1,600 horsepower, the sound of Soviet air power. Black exhaust smoke puffed from the stacks, then cleared. Petrov listened carefully. The engine ran smooth at idle. Good sign. No unusual sounds, no vibration he could feel through the airframe. Volkov advanced the throttle slowly. The propeller spun faster. Petrov watched for vibration. Nothing. The engine note rose, a deep, powerful rumble that you could feel in your chest. 50% power. Still smooth. Petrov glanced at the other mechanics. They were all watching the propeller, waiting for the vibration to start, waiting for the engine to shake itself apart. Volkov looked at Petrov through the canopy, raised his eyebrows. Petrov gave a thumbs up. Keep going. Volkov pushed the throttle to 75% power. The propeller became a blur. The exhaust stacks glowed red. The aircraft trembled slightly from engine torque, but there was no vibration from propeller imbalance. Then Volkov pushed to full military power. 1,600 horsepower screaming through the damaged propeller. Petrov held his breath. This was the moment. If the modification was going to fail, it would fail now. The engine would shake itself apart, or a propeller blade would crack from the structural weakness, or the imbalance would create a vibration that would destroy the engine mounts. Nothing happened. The aircraft sat rock steady. The propeller spun perfectly balanced. The symmetrical damage had worked. Petrov felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, but maybe its distant cousin. Relief, perhaps, or just the absence of immediate catastrophe. Behind him, one of the mechanics whispered, "Bože moi, my God." Another one laughed, a nervous sound that held more relief than humour. Volkov reduced power to idle, gave Petrov a salute through the canopy. Petrov returned it. Volkov taxied to the runway. Other mechanics had gathered to watch. They'd heard about Petrov's modification. Some thought he was crazy. Others were curious. One of them, a young kid named Sergei, who'd only been at the airfield for 2 weeks, asked Petrov what would happen if the propeller failed in flight. Petrov said, "Then Volkov dies and I get court-martialed," in that order. At 5:47 a.m., Volkov released the brakes, pushed the throttles forward, accelerated down the runway. The IL-2 lifted off after 400 meters, climbed at full power, banked northwest toward the German lines. Petrov watched until the aircraft became a speck in the grey morning sky, then disappeared completely. And then all he could do was wait. Could a single IL-2 with a deliberately damaged propeller stop 40 German panzers from breaking through Soviet lines? The next 33 minutes would answer that question. The attack began at 6:04 a.m. Volkov's IL-2 came in low over the Panzer formation, 50 feet above ground level, moving at 310 miles per hour. The German tanks were advancing in column formation along the Tsaritsa River Road, 40 Panzer IIIs and IVs heading for the gap in Soviet defences near the tractor factory. They weren't expecting air attack. Soviet air activity had been minimal for days. Most of their fighters and ground attack aircraft had been destroyed or were grounded for maintenance. The Panzers rolled forward confidently, crushing the rubble of destroyed buildings, their commanders standing in open hatches, scanning for Soviet defensive positions. They didn't look up. That was their first mistake. Volkov opened fire at 600 meters. The IL-2 carried two 23mm VYA cannons in the wing roots and two 7.62mm Ash-Cass machine guns. The 23mm cannons were designed specifically for anti-tank work. Each shell had a tungsten carbide core that could penetrate 25mm of armour at optimal impact angles. Panzer III armour ranged from 30mm to 50mm depending on location. The side and rear armour, particularly around the engine deck, was the thinnest, most vulnerable. Would Petrov's modification hold under sustained combat stress? Take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Eastern Front. Now back to Volkov's attack run. Volkov's first burst hit 3 tanks. The 23mm shells punched through the thin rear armour of 2 Panzer IIIs, detonating fuel and ammunition. Both tanks exploded immediately, fire and smoke erupting from the open hatches. The third tank took hits on the engine deck. The engine didn't explode, but it caught fire, thick black smoke pouring from the vents. The crew bailed out, running from the burning vehicle. The German column reacted. Tank commanders dropped into their hatches, crews traversed turrets, machine guns opened fire. Tracers filled the air around the IL-2. Most of the bullets bounced off the armoured cockpit, creating a sound like hail on a metal roof. Some rounds found gaps in the armour, hitting non-critical components. One bullet severed a hydraulic line in the left landing gear bay. Hydraulic fluid streamed out, but Volkov didn't know yet. He was focused on the attack. He pulled up, banked hard right, came around for another pass. The propeller handled the stress perfectly. No vibration, no unusual sounds. Petrov's modification was holding. Volkov lined up on the column again, this time from a different angle. The Germans were ready now, more alert, more guns tracking him. But the IL-2 was built for this, built to absorb punishment and keep fighting. Second pass. Volkov targeted the fuel trucks following behind the tanks. Softer targets but critical. Without fuel, the Panzers couldn't advance. He fired a 3-second burst. The 23mm shells ripped through 2 fuel trucks. They exploded in massive fireballs, flames shooting 50 feet into the air. The explosions set fire to a third truck and an ammunition carrier. The ammunition carrier cooked off, shells exploding in every direction, shrapnel cutting down German infantry who'd been riding on the tanks. The column stopped completely. Tanks pulled off the road, seeking cover. Crews frantically tried to suppress the fires. The advance halted. That was Volkov's objective. He didn't need to destroy every tank. He just needed to disrupt them enough to delay the attack, give Soviet defenders time to reinforce their positions. He made 2 more passes. By the end, 6 Panzer tanks were destroyed or burning. 4 fuel trucks were gone. 2 ammunition carriers had exploded, and the entire column was scattered along 2 kilometers of road, hiding behind buildings and in shell craters, unwilling to move forward while a single IL-2 owned the sky above them. Volkov turned for home. That's when he noticed the hydraulic failure light. Great. No landing gear hydraulics. He'd have to use the emergency hand pump to lower the gear for landing. Assuming the gear would even lock down with a damaged hydraulic system. He radioed Gumrack Tower, reported the damage, started the long process of hand-pumping the gear down while flying the aircraft with one hand. At 6:37 a.m., Volkov landed. The gear held. The propeller was still spinning normally, still perfectly balanced despite being deliberately damaged on all 3 blades. The aircraft rolled to a stop. Ground crew rushed up with fire extinguishers, checking for damage. Volkov shut down the engine, climbed out, looked at Petrov. "Your modification worked," Volkov said. Propeller ran perfectly, no vibration at all, even at full power. Petrov inspected the blades. All 3 gouges were intact. No additional damage, no cracks propagating from the filed areas. The modification had held through 50 minutes of flight time, including multiple high-power combat maneuvers. "I need you to do the same modification on 2 more aircraft," Volkov said. "We have 2 more IL-2s with propeller damage, not as bad as mine was, but enough to ground them officially. If you can balance them the same way, we can get them back in the air." Word spread quickly. By noon, mechanics from other squadrons were asking Petrov about the technique. How did it work? What were the measurements? How did you ensure the gouges were identical? Petrov explained it carefully. "Measure the existing damage precisely. Duplicate it exactly on the other blades. Same depth, same width, same position relative to the hub. The key was symmetry. Perfect symmetry created perfect balance, even if all 3 blades were damaged." What Petrov didn't know yet was that his improvised solution would spread across the entire 16th Air Army within weeks. But first, it had to survive combat testing. Over the next week, Petrov performed the modification on 14 different IL-2 propellers. Some had battle damage, some had damage from debris strikes. One had damage from a rough landing where the propeller struck the ground. In every case, the symmetrical damage modification worked. Aircraft that should have been grounded for weeks returned to combat within hours. The technique required precision. Not every mechanic could do it. Sergei, the young kid who'd watched Volkov's first flight, tried the modification on his own and got the measurements wrong. The propeller he modified vibrated worse than before. The test run lasted 30 seconds before the pilot shut down the engine, climbed out, told Sergei he'd nearly torn the engine off its mounts. Sergei was devastated, thought he'd ruined the aircraft. Petrov found him sitting behind the maintenance shed, head in his hands. Sergei was 19 years old, from Leningrad, had been working as a mechanic for exactly 3 weeks. He'd watched his entire family die during the German siege of his city. His father, his mother, his 2 younger sisters, all dead from starvation before he'd been evacuated and sent to Stalingrad. Now he thought he'd failed again. Petrov sat down next to him, told him the modification was salvageable, showed him how to remeasure the gouges, how to file them deeper to achieve perfect symmetry. They worked together for an hour. Sergei filed carefully, checking measurements every few strokes, exactly like Petrov taught him. When they finished, they ran the engine again. This time, smooth, perfect balance. Sergei's face lit up, first time Petrov had seen him smile since arriving at Gumrak. "You understand now?" Petrov asked. "Yes, comrade senior technician. Precision, symmetry, no shortcuts." "Good, now do it again on aircraft number 47. She's got a similar problem." Sergei did. Got it right the first time. By the end of September, Sergei had modified 7 propellers, all successful. He eventually got it right, but it took him 3 attempts. By October, mechanics across the 16th Air Army were using Petrov's technique. It wasn't official. It wasn't in any manual. No engineering authority had approved it. But it worked, and that was all that mattered in Stalingrad. The Germans noticed the increase in IL-2 activity. Their intelligence reports expressed confusion. Soviet aircraft losses were extremely high. Flak crews were claiming multiple kills every day. Luftwaffe fighters were shooting down Sturmoviks regularly. The math didn't add up. The Soviets shouldn't have had enough operational aircraft to maintain the sortie rate they were flying. Yet somehow, the attacks kept coming. German intelligence officers interrogated captured Soviet ground crew, asked about aircraft maintenance, repair capabilities, supply chains. The answers didn't help. Soviet logistics were a disaster, parts shortages everywhere. Factory production couldn't keep up with combat losses. On paper, the Soviet Air Force at Stalingrad should have been grounded weeks ago. But the IL-2s kept flying, attacking German positions every day, sometimes multiple times a day. It didn't make sense. One German officer wrote in his after-action report, "The enemy demonstrates remarkable ability to maintain combat operations despite catastrophic equipment losses. Their mechanics appear to perform miracles with damaged aircraft." He didn't know how right he was. Part of the reason was Petrov's modification. Aircraft that should have been permanently grounded kept flying. Damaged propellers that should have required factory replacement were field repaired and returned to service. The Soviet Air Force at Stalingrad was operating on a razor's edge, keeping aircraft flying through improvisation and desperation. But there was a cost. The modified propellers were weaker. They couldn't handle sustained maximum power the way undamaged propellers could. Pilots had to be careful, couldn't push the engines too hard for too long, and eventually the damaged blades would fail. Cracks would propagate from the filed areas. Blades would break. The question wasn't if a modified propeller would fail, the question was when. Volkov flew his modified propeller for another 6 days, 11 more missions. On September 29th, during a low-level attack on German artillery positions near Mamayev Kurgan, his aircraft took multiple hits from quad 20mm flak guns. One shell hit the propeller directly. Blade 3, the blade Petrov had filed, shattered. The sudden imbalance destroyed the engine in seconds. The engine literally tore itself off its mounts and fell away from the aircraft. Volkov lost all power at 200 feet altitude. He managed to crash-land the aircraft in no man's land between the German and Soviet lines. He survived the crash, but the IL-2 was upside down, on fire. Volkov hung from his harness, blood running down his face from a head wound. He could smell burning fuel. The aircraft was going to explode. He released the harness, fell to the canopy, kicked it open, crawled out. German machine gun fire immediately. Bullets kicked up dirt around him. He was 400 meters from Soviet lines. Might as well have been 400 kilometers. He started crawling. Left leg wasn't working right. Something wrong with his right shoulder. Couldn't lift his arm. Each meter felt like an hour. Halfway back, he found a shell crater, dropped in, caught his breath. His flight suit was soaked with blood. Couldn't tell if it was all his or if some belonged to someone else. Didn't matter. He could see Soviet positions ahead, friendly faces, safety, just had to cover 200 more meters. He crawled again. German mortars started falling. They'd spotted him. Wanted to finish the job. Explosions to his left, to his right. Closer, closer. One landed 5 meters away. The concussion knocked him unconscious. When he woke up, Soviet soldiers were dragging him behind their defensive line. He'd made it. Barely. They carried him to the field hospital. Medics cut away his flight suit, started working on his wounds. 3 bullet hits to his legs, 1 to his shoulder, multiple shrapnel wounds from the mortar blast. The senior medical officer looked at him, shook his head, said, "You should be dead." Volkov said, "Tell that to my mechanic. He's very good at keeping broken things flying." 2 days later, Petrov visited him in the field hospital. The hospital was a ruined factory building with blown-out walls and a tarp for a roof. 40 beds, all occupied. Wounded men everywhere. The smell of blood and disinfectant and gangrene. Volkov's left leg was in a cast from ankle to hip. His right shoulder was bandaged so heavily he looked like he was wearing armor. But he was smiling. "Viktor Sergeyevich," Volkov said, using Petrov's patronymic, "come to see your handiwork." Petrov pulled up a chair. It was missing a leg, tilted at an angle. "How do you feel?" "Like I crashed an aircraft into the ground at 200 kilometers per hour. The modified propeller gave you 11 extra missions you never would have flown otherwise." 12, Volkov corrected. "You're forgetting the first one." Petrov smiled. 12 then, worth it?" Volkov looked at his bandaged leg, at the rows of wounded soldiers around him. Some would live, some wouldn't. But they'd all fought, all done their part. He looked back at Petrov. "Absolutely," Volkov said. "Those missions probably saved lives, probably stopped German advances, probably made a difference." "Worth it?" Petrov asked. "Absolutely," Volkov said. The Battle of Stalingrad continued for another 4 months. The fighting got worse before it got better. By November, the city was rubble, buildings reduced to burned-out shells, streets filled with debris and bodies. By December, the German Sixth Army was surrounded, cut off, slowly freezing and starving in the ruins they'd tried to capture. By February 1943, it was over. The Soviets won. Field Marshal Paulus surrendered. 91,000 German soldiers went into captivity. Most would never return home. The IL-2 Sturmovik played a critical role in that victory. The Germans feared the Sturmovik more than any other Soviet aircraft. They called it Black Death because of its dark camouflage and its devastating attacks. They called it Fleischwolf, the meat grinder. Luftwaffe pilots were offered cash bonuses for shooting down IL-2s. 2,000 Reichsmarks per kill, because they were so difficult to destroy and so dangerous when they got through to their targets. Soviet industry built 36,183 IL-2s during the war, more than any other combat aircraft in history. It remains the most produced military aircraft ever made. Many of those aircraft flew with battle damage that should have grounded them. Many flew with field modifications that violated regulations but kept them operational. Petrov's propeller balancing technique was just one of hundreds of improvised solutions Soviet mechanics used to keep aircraft flying when proper repairs were impossible. The official Soviet Air Force maintenance records make no mention of Petrov's modification. There's no engineering analysis, no formal approval, no documentation. The technique existed in the gap between regulation and necessity, passed from mechanic to mechanic through word of mouth and hands-on demonstration. After Stalingrad, Petrov was transferred to a maintenance depot near Moscow. He trained other mechanics, taught proper procedures, emphasized following regulations. When asked about field modifications, he'd say they were sometimes necessary, but should only be done as a last resort, and only by experienced mechanics who understood the risks. He never mentioned the propeller modification specifically, never wrote it down, never claimed credit for it. In his mind, it was just one small thing he'd done to help keep aircraft flying. Nothing special, just part of the job. Viktor Petrov survived the war. He continued working as an aircraft mechanic until 1963, then retired to a small apartment in Volgograd, the city formerly known as Stalingrad. He died in 1987 at the age of 71. His obituary mentioned his military service but said nothing about propellers or field modifications or desperate improvisations that kept damaged aircraft flying during the darkest days of the war. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov also survived. He recovered from his wounds, returned to combat in March 1943, flew another 47 missions before the war ended. He shot down 3 German aircraft in air-to-air combat and destroyed 18 tanks, 31 trucks, and countless other vehicles in ground attacks. After the war, he became a test pilot, helped develop the next generation of Soviet attack aircraft. He retired as a colonel in 1969. When asked about his combat experiences, he'd sometimes mention the mechanic who'd kept his damaged aircraft flying by deliberately damaging it even more. People thought he was joking. The modification Petrov developed that September morning in Stalingrad was never officially adopted. It didn't need to be. It solved a specific problem in a specific place at a specific time. It kept aircraft flying when they should have been grounded. It gave pilots a fighting chance when regulations said they shouldn't fly at all. Sometimes the gap between regulation and reality requires improvisation. Sometimes the rule book doesn't have an answer. Sometimes you have to take a broken propeller and break it 2 more times to make it work. That's what Viktor Petrov did, and for a few critical weeks in Stalingrad, it made all the difference.